So first, let's start with the biggest topic of all. The United Nations has signaled that it's interested in giving Africa a seat at the United Nations Security Council, two permanent seats, interestingly, at the United States Security Council. Now, the thing is, for several decades now, Africa has been clamoring for representation at the United Nations Security Council. You know, the thing with the UN Security Council is that it was created, the United Nations itself was created following World War II. And then the victors of the World War II had that seat in the Security Council. So it's more like the league of the big boys, you know, the winners, we are the big deal. That's what it started out like. Anyway, for several decades now, Africa has been asking for representation in the Security Council, and not just Africa, even Latin America. Countries like India have been asking for representation in the United Nations because back then, when following World War II, when the United Nations was set up and the Security Council came into being, these five nations that are currently in the Security Council, that is United States, China, Russia, United Kingdom, and France, these five nations were undoubtedly world powers. But several years after the World War II, and we look at our world today, a lot of things have changed. And many of these players that used to be a big deal back then, they're not big deals anymore. For example, I think that India is more of a world power today than United Kingdom. So the way it seems like the Security Council is lost in time, right? So now that it's a good thing, I think it's a good thing. Now that it looks like the Security Council is about to change and the more representation is welcomed, like two seats for Africa, according to what the US said, two seats for Africa. I think they also mentioned Germany. But regarding Africa's representation at the Security Council, here's what I think. I'm not impressed. No, I really am not impressed by it. Here's the thing about the Security Council. The most important thing about the Security Council is not just having a seat, right? It's about getting that veto power. The veto power is to give you the power to kick out any policy or whatever it is that is going to stand against the interest of your country or your region. So if Africa is getting two seats at the Security Council, but these two seats are vetoless, what's the point? The point of the Security Council is the veto power. And if you're not getting veto power, what's the point? So it seems like Africa is welcomed into the room and we just have a seat at the door, not at the table. And so I'm not impressed at all. So how are we going to protect Africa's interest at the Security Council if we don't have veto power to kick out things that don't serve us? It doesn't make any sense. But this leads me to the question, what is Africa's interest? If we say we are going into the Security Council and we need veto power in the Security Council to defend Africa's interest, it leads me to ask the question, what is Africa's interest? And it's so embarrassing and it's so painful that I do not trust many of the leaders, not all, but many of the leaders we have in Africa today to defend Africa's interest. Many of them don't even know what is in Africa's interest. Many of them don't even know what is in the interest of their respective nations. For example, after the coup happened in Niger last year, Nigeria wanted to invade Niger because Niger got a government that some people outside did not like. So the people outside were using Nigeria to push their interests within West Africa and the continent at large. So my question is, if Nigeria had invaded Niger, if the president did not get the pushback that he got, and Nigeria had successfully invaded Niger, how was that in the interest of Nigeria? Not just Niger now, how was that in the interest of Nigeria? You think you would set your neighbor's house on fire and yours will not burn? Nigeria shares a very large border with Niger to the north of Nigeria. And you wanted to go there and set the country on fire. Do you get what I'm? So this is why I'm saying that even many of our leaders in Africa do not know what is in the interest of their respective countries. Talk more of the continent at large. Because if Nigeria had successfully invaded Niger and set Niger on fire, Nigeria would have burnt as a result of that fire. And that fire, who knows if it hadn't spread throughout West Africa and maybe affect the whole continent. So that's why before we can even say we want to take a stand in the, this is my opinion, before we think we should be thinking to take a stand in the United Nations Security Council, we should first decide what is in Africa's interests. Because if we had that kind of scenario play out in Africa last year when Nigeria wanted to march into Niger, what else can we do that is against the interest of Africa? Now, the third thing I want to say about this is that this idea of giving Africa. Yes, Africa is a continent, so it's not a country. We get, but this when Africa came into that was 2022. Is it 2022 or 2023? But recently, that last year or 2 years ago, when Africa came into the G20, it came in as the African Union. So it wasn't like South Africa is already in the G20, but Africa as a whole was more like represented at the G20 as the African Union. Do you get? So when United States is signaling their interest to bring representation for Africa in the Security Council, why wasn't it just one seat for the African Union? Because the African Union, well, it has its flaws and its issues, but the African Union, we can say this, we can all say that this is our representation. Instead of getting off the four African nations, this is our representation. But the fact that two seats are given, I think this is the classic divide and conquer. Yes, because why give two seats? Why not one? You can argue that Africa is a huge continent. We could have just used one and used the African Union for that. But if we have two seats, this might begin to, it might be an issue of pitting Africa against each other because our, our bond is not yet very strong across the continent. Our bond, our uniting bond is not very strong. So if we have an issue where only two of you, then the issue is with who is going to be the two? Are we going to take from West Africa and Southern Africa? What about North Africa and East Africa and Central Africa? Or are we going? You see where this thing can be an issue? If we say, okay, it's going to be Nigeria and South Africa, what happened to Kenya? What happened to Egypt? Egypt is a military power. Egypt is a large country. What about Ethiopia? Ethiopia is the second largest nation on Africa. Do you get me? So it can cause friction within a continent that is not very strong in unity. It can cause friction. So I believe that the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, said it best. He said we should have one permanent seat for the African Union, then the other seat should be a rotating seat, which makes sense. If Africa wants to take up this opportunity and say yes, at least let's get into the um, Security Council to make debates that benefit Africa. I think the best way to do it is to have one seat for the, according to the suggestion of Paul Kagame, we should have one seat for the African Union and the other seat that will be rotating among different African countries. But having said that, this whole thing of giving Africa two seats in the Security Council without veto power is not impressive at all. So what do you think about it? Should Africa jump into the Security Council with no veto power? And which countries do you think should represent Africa? Which two nations do you think should represent Africa in the Security Council? Let me know your suggestions in the comment section below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with your friends so that we can reach more people across the continent.